Hi, this is Jeff, and this is Photoshop Layers. Now, before we go too much further, it's important that we talk about layers. The only thing that probably is more key to how Photoshop operates than selection is layers, because we'll use selection to actually identify items, but we'll use layers to separate them so we can edit them piecemeal, away from each other in isolation. So let's go ahead and go back to Photoshop, and I've already got a selection here. The very first thing I'm going to do, though, is I'm actually going to save this file as a PSD. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to save it as a Photoshop file. I'm actually just going to call this Pink Flower, and I'm going to go ahead and save it to my desktop. Alright, now notice it's kept my selection here, but just in case, I want to make sure that actually I come up here and I go to Select, and I want to do Save Selection. And I'm going to call this Pink Flower, and I'm going to do New just behind this, and I'm going to say OK. Alright, so that's my selection, and I've saved my selection. So that's going to be easy to return to later. So let's go ahead and get started with actually working with layers. Okay, so to start working with layers, the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw your attention over here to the right to our layers palette. This is where we'll see the different layers in our composition. By default, the opening layer of any flat image that would come out of a camera or a scanner or anything like that is going to be called background. It's going to have this little lock next to it. So let's make sure, first of all, that we can edit this layer from the get-go. So one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to double-click on that, and it's going to come up, and by default it's called Layer 0. Well, I'm just going to call it BKG for background, and I'm going to say OK. Notice all of a sudden the lock goes away, and this layer is now fully editable. So that's the first thing we can do to make a layer editable. However, let's go a couple steps beyond that. Let's say I really don't want to lose this original layer because I might want to do something else later, or I want to have an undo. So probably one of the things I need to know how to do is actually be able to copy this layer and actually make changes to it. So to do that, I'm going to go up here to Layer, and I'm actually going to go Duplicate Layer. It's going to ask me what to call it, and I'm just going to call this Pink Flower again. Alright, now I've got a whole new layer that has the exact same content in it that's a copy of our lower layer down here. So these two items have the exact same content in them. How do I prove that to you? Well, let's go over here to the eye icon and actually make the top layer disappear. Notice you don't see any difference. We're still looking at the same content, just the same content in two different layers. So if I turn this back on, again you don't see it. But how can I really draw this out for you and help you understand that the content is actually existing on two different layers? Well, let's do this. So on the top layer, I'm going to go up here and I'm going to do Select, and I'm going to do Inverse. And that's actually going to select everything on the outside of my original selection. So it's actually inverted my selection. So everything but the flower now is selected in my image. And I'm actually going to flip over here to the lower background layer, and I'm going to turn it off. And then, with this all still selected, I'm going to hit Delete. Notice the entire background disappears. That's because I've essentially turned off the layer beneath it and then wiped everything else out of this layer. So I'm looking through it. It's completely transparent to me. Alright, so I still want to work with this flower a little bit. So let's go back here and let's do Select. And let's actually go back to Inverse again. Alright. So I'm back to selecting the flower once more. Now I want to actually do a different type of layer management than I did in the previous demonstration with wiping out the background. This time I want to keep the background in a layer, but I also want to have the flower itself in a layer above that. So how would I go about that? Well, I'm going to go up here and I'm going to go Layer, and I'm going to do New, and I'm going to do Layer via Cut. As you notice, I now don't see any difference in my photo over here on the left hand side in my preview, but if I turn the background off over here, it disappears. If I turn the flower off over here in layer 1, it disappears. So these two elements are now in completely separate layers. A lot of times you'll want to actually use this to isolate a piece of content so that you can do other things to it. Let me demonstrate. So let's say I really want to crank up the color, really want to make the flower that I've now put in the foreground on layer 1 over here. Let's say I really want to make that stand out. Well, how I can do that is I can actually, just to demonstrate, go over here to Image and go to Adjustments, and let's actually do Hue and Saturation. Now, we'll get into this later, but for now, it's a really good demonstration of how we've isolated an element and we can actually change it. I can actually change the color value of just the flower without affecting the background. Now, a fun one to do is saturation, and I can really kind of crank up the color value and just adjust the hue a little bit. And notice I can kind of make this a total electric green with a really bright flower. If I go too far, notice it will make it a little bit fake, but it kind of still looks cool, so I'm going to hit OK. But I didn't affect the rest of the photo. Since these two pieces of content, the flower and the background, are on two different layers, I was actually able to isolate the flower and change it without changing the background. Alright, so what else can we do with layers? Well, one of the things that we can start to mess with is transparency, or as we'll often refer to it in Photoshop here, opacity. So, how could I demonstrate that? Well, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here and I'm going to turn off my background layer that I've separated from my foreground layer. And I'm going to actually go to our background layer that's got the original content in it, and I want to duplicate it. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to go to Layer, and I'm going to say Duplicate Layer. We're going to call this Gray Background, and you'll understand why in a moment. Alright, I'm going to turn back over here to the Layers palette, and I'm going to turn the eyeball next to our original background off. And with the gray background selected and the eyeball next to it, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to go to Image, and I'm going to go Adjustments, and I'm going to select Black and White. In this menu, I'm just going to select Auto because it's pretty good, and I'm just going to set OK. Notice my background now in this version of the file is now black and white. Also, all the content is really there. I've left on the top flower here so you can see it, but if I turn it off, I've got a gray version of the flower. However, I kind of like that effect of having the colorful flower against the gray background, and so I'm going to leave that on for right now. And I want to mess with the opacity or the transparency of this layer in between them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here with the background pink flower layer selected, and I'm going to drag it down to about, say 35%. And that's close enough. And notice I get some of the gray detail, which I can actually click off in order to demonstrate, showing through, and I get a lot of the color detail over it. So I've kind of successfully emulated kind of that old-time photographic film feel, but just by using layers and using transparency to differentiate and blend the content between them. Alright, so before we move on and go to a different topic involving layers, which is going to be advanced layers, I just want to show you a couple things that will be useful to you about managing layers real quick here. And the two easiest ones to remember are this little guy down here, which creates a new layer for you at any point. See, I can just keep creating new layers. And the guy right next to it, which actually will let you delete layers. And it asks you to confirm it, but notice I can delete layers that I've created. This is pretty handy for keeping layers under control. A lot of times you'll create multiple layers to try a technique out and experiment as you go along. So I just want to make sure you're aware of those before we get into too many more advanced layer techniques. That pretty much sums it up for layers. I'll see you in the next one.